Welcome to episode 113 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. I came across a new book recommended to me by my friends at Books Forward. It's called Welcome to Monsterville, and it's illustrations of various monsters with an accompanying poem. If I stopped here, you might be left wondering, how am I tying this into Anchored in Education? That is a great question. Now, let me tell you the backstory. This book came about when the late illustrator Michael Rothenburg began using art therapy to help him through various challenges. He would then send them to his friend and accomplished poet Laura Shovan, who would write a poem to go with the illustration. When these two friends started this, it wasn't for the purposes of a book. It was to cope with things life was throwing at them. One of those things was the COVID-19 pandemic. It was only later when they realized the message they could get out by publishing these works. Welcome to Monsterville reminds us as educators that sometimes we need to value process over product. It also has huge implications as an SEL teaching tool, which is just one area that I was fortunate enough to speak about with my guest today, Laura Shovan. Laura, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
I'm excited to talk to you as well, but I'm even more excited for you to talk to the listeners, and especially about Welcome to Monsterville, and we'll get into that. But before we can do that, and before we can get started with today, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Oh, it's such a complicated story in a way. My mom grew up in England right after wartime, and she was pulled out of school when she was 15 years old. My grandfather didn't really believe in education, especially not for girls, and I think she always harbored a secret wish that I would become a teacher because that just wasn't available to her. So I think that was a piece of it, but also my real model for what it means to be an educator was a woman named Muriel Becker.
Okay.
And she had been a classroom educator, and then she became methods of teaching English professor to grad students at the university where I went for my master's degree. And she was just so passionate about reading. She loved science fiction, and she was a working mother and an incredibly generous mentor. So she was my go-to person during my first years teaching high school English. And now, it's 20 years later, and I'm working with grad students at Vermont College of Fine Arts. And Muriel is still like my standard of the commitment it takes to be a thoughtful educator. She was a really important person in my life.
Did you ever have the opportunity to, at some point, go back and visit with her and let her know what kind of impact she had on you?
Well, she died not too long after we moved to Maryland, so I was still, in the early stages of my career, but I was very close with her. She actually lived up the street from me and my husband, so we did spend quite a bit of time together after I had gotten my master's degree. And, yes, I like to think that she knew I was very fond of her, but yeah, I think she knew how important she was in my life, but couldn't have known how it would play out over the years.
I love that. I love nothing more than hearing a story of becoming anchored in education and seeing that, we become anchored because of someone else, which, I've shared many times on this podcast. The reason I became anchored was because of a teacher. And, it has such a profound impact on how I go about, but also knowing that I very well could be that next teacher to inspire someone else. And to me, that's what really makes this profession just fun and just rewarding and giving back. So now I want to shift our conversation to what we're talking about today, in which you recently published a book titled Welcome to Monsterville with illustrator and your friend Michael Rothenburg. What is interesting, though, is how this book came to be. And while we're going to get into all of the uses and that, educators could use and students and parents and I want my audience to really hear the development of these illustrations and poems and how it came to be a published book. So can we start the conversation there today?
Yeah, absolutely. So Michael was a dear friend. I knew him through the poetry world. He was the founder of a nonprofit called 100,000 Poets for Change, very involved in the kind of like the intersection of poetry and activism. And I believe in 2019, in early 2019, his son had passed away from addiction. And Michael was in deep, deep grief. He wasn't able to write and eventually turned to art therapy as an outlet. And I had been to visit him and his wife, Terry, in January of 2020, so right before the pandemic hit. And, he'd shown me some of the things he was working on in art therapy, and they were mostly abstract. And when I came home, he sent me this image, and it was of this creature, and I was like, what this is? So it was like a blue creature with a kind of like a halo, and it's blowing bubbles, and it has 6 feet. Yeah. It has a tail that either looks like flames or bacon, depending on your point of view. Right. And I knew that he was sad, feeling sad. And so I wrote a poem about this monster as if the poem is in the voice of a child and the monster is moving into the house next door. And so I wrote it, I recorded it probably within an hour or so, sent it off to Michael, didn't think anything of it. And Michael was just the type of person, he was really a creative force. And very quickly was like, we're going to do a series. And could this be a book? And I have so many ideas. That's just how he was. It was one of the joys of being Michael's friend. And so it really just started as a gift from one friend to another, and very quickly we started to think of it as a larger project. To me, it was interesting because Michael said, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but he felt like because he's a poet and a working poet, there was too much emotion in a way attached to language at that time in his life. And something about making these creatures, there was freedom in it. He didn't judge what he was doing. He didn't think about it. And he said to me one time, he felt like I was interpreting the monsters through my poems because the language of poetry just wasn't available to him in that moment in his grief. And I think between that and the pandemic, I think that's why there's so much emotion coming through the poems. Some of them are joyful. Some of them are about fear, about anxiety, about sadness. And I just think we were all feeling such a mix of emotions at that time. And for Michael in particular, it was very heightened because of the grief experience that he had been having.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of times we not only felt all of those emotions, but I think a lot of times we didn't understand which emotions we were truly feeling at the time. And, we definitely are going to talk more about that. I want to go back to, you were describing what would be the second monster and second poem in the book. Neighbor was the title of that poem. And for one, so I'm looking at it now, and now I see bacon as a tail, and I never did before. So now I will only see bacon on. But what I'm curious about is, From the time, because I mean, you said, it was about an hour from when you sat down and, you wrote it, recorded it, and sent it back. And then you realized, like, okay, this is a project we're going to undertake. What was about the turnaround time then from when you would receive a new drawing to when you would send back a poem?
So, like I said, Michael, creative force. The monsters were he was just doing them one after another. He was just, something about it really opened him up. And so I think I couldn't even tell you. I got all the monsters within a couple of months, and I was well behind him and getting the poems done. And he kept nudging me. He would be like, where we got to finish. When are you going to, what are you doing? Like, why is this taking so long? So, part of our process also was I have a lot of poet friends who read work for me. So I did send, once we had the 16 monsters, I did send the book out or the manuscript out to a bunch of friends and got feedback from them. And Michael and I discussed the feedback. So it was a very collaborative project in many ways. Sometimes he would send me a sketch and we would discuss color choices together. Often we would talk about the poems since he was a poet, tweaking lines and words and things like that. So that was a real gift. And I'll tell you, Scott, we would talk, on Zoom because pandemic. But we also had a Facebook chat going, and I saved the chat because it's such a wonderful conversation about the nature of creativity, what it means to be a creative person and engage in creative play. So that to me was another part of the gift of this, was being able to have this conversation with my friend about what it means to be a creative human being.
Yeah, I love the illustrations of each monster and the unique poem that accompanies. Now, I'm just going to give you forewarning. Before this is over, I'm going to ask you about your favorite one, so you can be thinking out of the 16 now. But right now that we've learned more on the development, I'm wondering if we could speak on how important it is for adults to stay connected to their inner child through art therapy.
Yeah. Well, I don't know a lot about art therapy. As you know, there's a beautiful introduction to the book by a woman named Mercedes Termott, who's a former president of the American Art Therapy Association. And she also really connected with the book because of some things that were going on in her life and as a parent. But, Michael and I spoke with Mercedes. And so I have some things that Michael said of his drawings. And one of the things he said that I think was really interesting, he said when he was in his grief, that the nonverbal part of him was what was functioning. And he felt that doing the drawings were allowing him to go on he said, they give me oxygen. So having that kind of like the art to do where it was, he didn't have to interpret what he was doing. He didn't have to think about it. It was just very unlabored. He was having a good time. So he said, I never knew what I was going to do each day. My goal was to draw magical creatures and their conjurings. Where did these weird creatures come from? So for Michael, it was being in a state of innocence. I feel like a lot of us who are artists, we have a primary medium that is our work and often our income. For me, I'm a novelist and a poet, but many of us also have other creative outlets that we don't monetize on purpose, or that we might even work on to like improve our creative skills, and that can often be purely for play and for exploration. So I don't know if you've been on my Instagram, Scott, but I have a series of robot doodles that I post on Instagram.
Okay.
And that's like just a silly creative outlet. Yeah. I don't judge them. I just share them because they're for fun. And I think that's part of what was going on with Michael with this project. But I do feel like there's a reason why creative play is good for everybody, adults and for kids. And I have been doing some research into this, and I think it's connected to neuroscience.
All right.
So I've been reading up on how our brains cope with surprise and the unexpected. And what I found out is that when you give a person a task that includes an element of surprise, kind of like when I was receiving these strange monsters and having to write a poem, highly creative people are really, really good at making unexpected connections. So this is something that's been studied. So when we engage with creative play, we're helping our brains to practice thinking outside the box and coming up with unexpected solutions to problems. So it's really creative play. Of course, it's fun, but it's also really good for our brain health because it just puts us in a state of thinking of different ways to solve problems.
You know, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation for listeners to hear, because I think too often, you know, we could learn so much from kids, and the creative play is part of that. But as adults, it's like a lot of times we ingrain ourselves that we must always be just on the side of professional and the side of business and the side of, like you said, where we generate income from, whatever that may be. And just being able to, you know, do something creatively and do something that is outside of our norm but brings us joy. I mean, I think we can see where that just has so many positive effects on just our emotions, our, you know, well-being, be that, you know, personal. I think that a lot of times that could really help even our physical well-being, because, you know, the stress and other tolls on our body often weighs on us. So, you know, you've spoken on having a process over product mindset. I'll be the first to admit, as I just said, I struggle with this as an adult. You know, because I'm a product mindset a lot of times, and I cannot even begin to tell you the stumbling blocks that I face when I only think of the product and not the process. So let me even go back to as a child, you know, when it came to Legos, then I was process over product all the time, because I never wanted to follow, you know, I never wanted to build a car. I wanted to turn it into a plane. I'm wondering if we can expand on it a little bit to help listeners understand how this process over product mindset benefits folks of all ages.
Yeah, I love that you played with Legos. We're a big Lego family at my house. So.
I mean, full disclaimer, if you give me a bucket of Legos, I will completely do that over anything professional. Like, I still enjoy Legos.
There you go. That's your creative play. I love that. Love Legos. Anyway,
yeah.
I do want to start by saying, like, we are adults, and sometimes we do have to put product first.
Sure.
I used to write education features for my local newspaper when we first moved to Maryland, and if I had an article due and I wanted to get paid, I had to have the product in, right?
Yeah, sure.
But for me, I like to set aside some time for process. So one of the things that I've developed over the years is I have a group that I run every February. It's a group of about 30 to 40 poets. And we take the month of February, shortest month of the year, on purpose, and we work on process. So in this group, the idea is that we get a writing prompt in the evening, and by the next day, you're supposed to share a response poem.
Oh, wow.
And it's posted in our private group, and people are reacting to what you wrote. And the understanding is everybody is sharing a very first draft that was written within one day. And sometimes we do a little polishing or revision before we post it, and sometimes we don't. I can promise you, over the 28 days, you may have some winners that you might eventually go on to publish, but you're going to have some stinkers.
Yeah, sure.
And just getting comfortable with that, getting comfortable with, you know, every day I'm going to write something, and I'm going to let go of whether it has to be good or not. And I'm going to have some accountability to the group that, you know, that I've done my writing for the day, my poem for the day. And to me, that group has been really important because, you know, I think especially as creatives, you get in your head sometimes, you do think about, like, is this publishable? Am I going to enter this in a contest? And to spend a month out of every year where you have to, by necessity, put those thoughts aside and just, you know, what am I going to write about today? So how am I going to, when I receive a prompt, because the prompts don't come from me, they come from the members of the group.
Okay.
So it's like the neuroscience of surprise, right? Every day we're getting a surprise that we have to write in response to. So it's like this continual problem solving, creative problem solving of, let me give you an example, Scott.
Yeah,
so
please.
This year, I will never forget, one of our writing prompts was a photo of a man with an ice beard. And I didn't know even that this was a thing. Apparently on Lake Michigan, there are people who surf in the wintertime with beards
Okay.
on purpose so that when they're done surfing, they have these giant ice beards. And so when I'm talking about surprise, I'm talking about sometimes that level, like something you didn't even know existed. And now you have to write something about it. And you have to focus on process then, because the information isn't even coming from your own brain, it's coming from elsewhere. And it's interesting to me because it's where, some idea that you had, something that you saw, and then this new information, that's what comes together to create the poem. And that's what I find so fascinating when we're able to focus on process.
Yeah, well, I'm making a note to search ice beards, but that's a different time. But I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm thinking of how educators are a lot of times. I use the word perfectionist, but that goes back to the product, and we're so worried over what the product is that we lose ourselves in the process, and we don't, I think a lot of it, we don't appreciate what the process is, because I'm sure the number of poets that you're talking about in this group are talented individuals. And, but to challenge them, you have to me, you have to stand before maybe the imperfections of, like you said, a poem, and go with just almost like a first thought kind of thing, and begin building off of that. How exciting is that group that you lead? A key aspect we have learned about Welcome to Monsterville is that it supported both you and Michael in an emotional way in the midst of a pandemic. Now, a huge benefit of this book is that it also supports social-emotional learning in an educational setting. I'm wondering if you'd mind sharing how educators can use this book to promote SEL learning with students.
Sure thing. As you may know, I'm a poet in the schools for the Maryland State Arts Council, and I've been doing that for many years. And so this spring was the first time that I took this book with me into the classroom as a model for kids. And I've just been having some incredible conversations with them. First of all, backpedal for a second. I think that poems in particular, not necessarily just this book, but poems in general, are such a wonderful platform for kids to get kids talking about emotions, their interests, their feelings, their hopes. When you present a classroom of, usually I work with elementary schoolers, but
Sure.
any age classroom with a poem, their poems are conversation starters. We don't always have to analyze the poem. Like sometimes that's the thing that we're doing, and that's fine. But sometimes we can just talk about how the poem made us feel. And it's such a good jumping off point. So that's what's happening with this book. There's a poem in this book called Green Cave, which is about a child who's feeling very angry and self-soothes by going outside into nature. And I had an incredible conversation with a group of fourth graders about how they self-soothe. So after we read the poem, the kids were talking about, I pet my dog, I ride my bike, I listen to music. Just to talk about self-soothing is a thing that we do, and giving it a name was really important. So what I've been doing is, as I've taken the book out, I've learned, it took me a few tries because, I'm an educator and you're always tweaking,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
That's the perfectionist part. So the kids told me that it was helpful for them to draw their own monster first, ask themselves how that monster is feeling, and then write a poem about it. And they've really begun opening up about their social emotional lives. Like I said, they were talking about how they reset when they're feeling angry. I had a student who created this proud monster, who wrote about how when you're proud, the light shines out of you bright enough for the whole world to see. So like using hyperbole, which was great.
Sure.
So I've seen just like the most inventive, honest poems. One that I really liked was another fourth grader had an excited monster and wrote these lines. His hair is flying out like on a stormy day. He's running outside. Get out of my way. So that was the excited monster. And like I said, it doesn't have to be this book, but I think poetry in general, when we use it to read and share in the classroom and also use it as a prompt for writing, it opens up something in students. You know, I've been working as a poet in the schools for more than 20 years and talked to other people who do the same work that I do. And we all feel this way, that when you make poetry available to children, it really does touch something in them and encourages them to talk about their own or write about their own experiences and feelings.
Yeah, I can absolutely see where reading this book and you know, especially with the book, you know, looking at the images and really seeing, I like to look at the illustrations first and kind of create in my head a little bit like, what do I think this monster's thinking? What do I think? And then I read and like, okay, now I learned a little bit more about him. Can I go back and can I see that in them? And it was fun. And I found myself, like you said, in so many ways of the different components of social emotional learning, even in myself. So that's why on today's episode page, there's going to be a link where listeners can go get this book and make sure they put it on their bookshelf too. Now,
thank you so much.
Absolutely. Laura, before we go, as promised, I'm going to ask you if there is a favorite monster or poem that you have. But more importantly, what do you hope is a key takeaway for readers when they finish the book? And I'll let you address those in any order, and then I'll tell you what my favorite one was too.
Well, my key takeaway is this idea of encouraging kids or anybody who reads this book to sit with emotions. Like we were talking about, in a way, emotions are a process, right? So what if we choose not to judge those emotions and just sort of let them be and let them settle and experience them, and not judge or say, you know, anger is a bad feeling, so I'm going to push that aside, or sadness, I'm not allowed to cry, I'm not allowed to feel sad, so I have to, you know, pretend that I'm feeling okay when I'm really not. And instead allow those feelings to be and feel them and just kind of work through the process of having them. And that's a lot of what Michael and I were thinking about with this book. So because we were talking about Green Cave,
yeah.
Although I'm going to not pick a favorite, but I'll read that poem.
Okay.
This
yes,
poem
please.
is very much an experience out of my own childhood. So when I was a kid, and if I was feeling, it was really loud at my house, and I don't want to say necessarily a quiet person, but I definitely need my quiet time to resettle when things are overwhelming. So I would go outside, and in our backyard, there was a big forsythia bush. And in the summertime, when the leaves were really full, because of the way the leaves cascaded over, it would make a little cave. And that's where I would go and sit to kind of self-soothe, like we were talking about. So I'll read the poem. Okay. And just to describe for people, the image that goes with this poem is this magical bird of many, many different colors. And so that's what was in my mind when I was writing this poem. Green Cave. Sometimes I get so mad the feelings can't stay inside. Before I know what I'm doing, my feet run for the back door. I duck under the forsythia bush. In summer, the branches arch to make a cave exactly my size. Once I was under there, poking in the dirt, when two blue feet slipped under the leafy branches. A monstrous bird walked into my hiding spot, It opened its beak. The monster sang about being so angry that it feels like a million arrows are prickling your skin. Its wings beat to the song's rhythm like a soft, calm breath. Ever since then, when I'm so mad I can't stay inside, I go to the green cave and listen for the monster's song.
Laura, I'm so thankful that you shared and read for us Green Cave. It's just one example of a total of 16 in the book Welcome to Monsterville, available. A link on my website. They can go out to see that. Not only am I thankful that you shared that, but I'm thankful that you stopped by Anchored in Education today to talk more about just not only the book, but the implications that it can have for all of the readers out there.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful for any conversations we get to have about education, and especially poetry education, and how important it is to make that available in our classrooms, what it can mean for kids' social emotional learning when poetry is presented as a way to get them talking about their feelings. So thank you so much, Scott. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Now, you can read more about Laura on today's episode page. Simply head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the podcast tab at top. You will also find links to Laura on social media, as well as a link to the book, Welcome to Monsterville. And don't forget, if you have not already, please subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. If you want to rate it, share it, like it, and just generally get the message out about it, hey, I'd appreciate that too. After this interview, Laura and I spent a few minutes talking about poetry. She told me that you do not need to have a deep understanding of poetry styles to enjoy poetry, to which I said I was glad, because I am definitely in the realm of enjoying poetry. This is just one more example of how adults often complicate good things with overthinking. We hear the word poetry or illustrations, and we often think that it won't have a measurable impact on us. Like I say, so many times we can learn a lot from children. When I read each poem of Welcome to Monsterville, I allowed myself to get lost in the words. I found myself staring at the illustrated monsters for minutes, almost like I was trying to connect with them and bring them to life to come off the pages. I read a book recently in which it talked about emotions and moods. The author went so far as to break down what being in a bad mood means. Is our bad mood one of resignation, despair, distrust, cynicism, confusion, panic, or resentment? Who knew there was so much more than just being in a bad mood? Knowing how complex our emotions can be, we need to take note of what Laura said about finding our creative outlet. Maybe it is running, drawing, painting, photography, journaling. The list could go on. We need something because bottling it up isn't going to last. I encourage you to check out Welcome to Monsterville. And remember, at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.